World's number one, Magnus Carlsen, invented a new chess opening for black. In this video, I will explain what it is, how it works, and how you can play it in your own chess games. Magnus Carlsen played a game with the black pieces against an international master from Morocco with the name Ilyas Msellek, and the game was played in Title Tuesday on chess.com. It's a very interesting and instructive game, but most importantly, look at what happened in the opening and make sure to subscribe to the channel as well. Let's have a look. d4, knight f6, white goes for the main move, c4, and here Magnus sacrifices a pawn with the move b5. This is a strange move, but it has been played before. But the question is, what happens if white just captures that pawn? C takes b5. That's a very logical move, of course. Now, in earlier games, black players have opted here for the move a6, so that after b takes a6, bishop takes a6, you're a pawn down, but you do get a bit of play for it. It's not really good, but it's playable. Here, this is the big moment in the game already on move 3, because Magnus plays now a move which has never occurred in a real chess game. Look at this. He went for this move, c5, which is sacrificing a second pawn. Now there are two main options, and I will also show you what happened in the game. But first, let's have a look. If you just take the pawn en passant, b takes c6, then the idea for black is that you do recapture with the knight, and despite being a pawn down, you do have quite some nice development. Your knights are already in the game, you do have a half open file for your rook, and because the pawns on c7 and b7, they are no longer there, also your bishop and your queen, they can quickly be brought into play. It's a very interesting and original opening concept. It has never been tested in practice, so we will be curious to see what happens in future games. The other critical move is what happens if white is just capturing the pawn on c5 with the move d takes c5. Then you're two pawns down as black. You really got to prove yourself here. I think that Magnus' idea is now here to play the move e6 to intend winning the pawn back on c5. Let's say if you play a move like knight f3, just continue developing, then black is gonna take that pawn. And okay, you're still a pawn down as black, but you do have very nice development. You can get your bishop to b7, you can castle, you can occupy the center, you have an extra pawn there. So there's definitely some play as compensation for the pawn. However, instead of playing a move like knight f3, what happens if white decides to protect the pawn on c5 with the move b4? Well, now, look at this. Black can challenge that pawn formation with the move a5. That's a beautiful idea. Now there is a lot of tension on the queen side, and this can really confuse white players. Now, for instance, if you do take that pawn on a5, now you have a lot of possibilities as black, but the easiest move here is to take with the queen the pawn on a5 with check. So white has to solve the check, then you can take the pawn on b5, and next the pawn on c5 will be eliminated as well. With an open game and easy piece play for black. This is looking great. So therefore, taking the pawn on a5, I don't think it's problematic. But what about a move like a3, trying to keep that pawn formation intact? Well, then there's the typical idea to take the pawn on b4, and white can actually not take the pawn back on b4 because the rook on a1 is simply hanging. Therefore, a3 is also not a good move. How about this? Can white just capture the pawn en passant? This is a critical move. And after knight takes a6, well, white is still two pawns up, but black is intending to win the pawn on b4. If the pawn on b4 is dropping, then the bishop can just capture on c5 with excellent dynamical play here for black. So here again, if you protect the pawn on b4 with a move like a3, there is this tactic, knight takes b4, and the pawn cannot recapture because the rook on a1 is hanging. That's not good. If you instead move the queen to b3, for instance, to protect that pawn on b4, the idea is to put a rook on b8, to hit the pawn on b4, And you're not only hitting the pawn on b4, even if white decides to defend the pawn with a3 or bishop d2, for instance, you can simply capture with the knight or even with the bishop on c5. And because the b pawn is pinned, you cannot recapture as white. The queen on b3 is standing in the same file as the rook. So this is a very original opening concept, and we can only hope to see more games being played with this fantastic new idea by Magnus Carlsen. Well, in the game, Msellek was definitely intimidated by this strange opening concept, being caught by surprise already on move 3. He reacted in a bad way. He just decided to play here the move b6, giving back the pawn. But why would you do that? I don't think this is such a great idea. It was not needed at all to give up that pawn on b5. It was nicely placed there. Now you give it back so easily. What should black do? Well, I think taking the central pawn is a good idea. It's a valuable pawn and makes it harder for white to complete its development. You can get your knight out to c6 very soon and so on. But it was not played. Magnus probably was just happy to get the possibility of taking back the pawn immediately. If white takes on c5, you do take back with the b pawn. You have a nice advantage in the center with an overwhelming pawn majority. Now, I think white should try to maintain that pawn on d4. He can do that with a move like e3, so that if you do take, you can take back with the pawn. And, well, it's an interesting game. Black is comfortable, but probably it's, objectively speaking, relatively balanced still. Instead, they follow the move knight f3. Black play the move e6, knight c3. Both sides are continuing with their own development. White brings the bishop out to f4. And here, another very interesting moment, as you would probably expect the bishop to be developed to e7, preparing the king to castle on the next move, or just get a knight to c6. Both are reasonable moves, but the move played by Magnus is very interesting. He decided to give up his beautiful bishop on b7 with the move bishop takes f3. Well, the idea is that if you do take back with the g-pawn, then later on maybe the white king may be in trouble. His king side will be seriously damaged because of that capture. So he decided to take back with the e-pawn so that the bishop can be developed very soon. But now, pawn takes d4. White has to recapture, of course. Queen takes d4. And here the knight can be developed with tempo, attacking the queen. The queen goes away. And here the bishop goes to b4. This is excellent. And now you see that white doesn't really get a chance now to develop with the move bishop e2. It would run into the move knight e5, hitting the bishop, attacking the knight on c3. And black will probably damage that pawn structure by taking on c3 at some point. This is a very good position for black. Therefore, instead of developing the bishop from f1, bishop d6 was played, offering the exchange of bishops and preventing the black king from castling. Black has to take. Queen takes d6, and now you need to get rid of that very annoying queen. And Magnus played a logical move, queen to e7. He wants to get rid of that queen. If queens are coming off the board, then black has a fantastic queenless middle game with an extra pawn, already a passed pawn, which can be placed on d5. It's a better pawn structure for black and more piece activity. So that's something white was definitely not interested in to enter. He decides to keep the queens on the board, but now black castles, the bishop goes to b5, the rook goes to c8. Black is very comfortable, but still position should objectively be more or less equal. White castles, and here you would just expect black to place the pawn in the center. That's something you always want to do to gain control over the critical squares of the board. Magnus decides to refrain from playing it yet. Plays here the move h6. I thought this was an interesting move, not needed, but now you know that there is never going to be any sort of back rank problem. So keep that in mind. That's something you can also always use in your game. Now the rooks are free to move, and we will see the difference with white's position later on. Rook fe1, queen goes to c5. Not sure what the queen is exactly doing there. Here, maybe a move like rook c1 to oppose the queen comes into consideration. But the move a3 was played, and this is a step in the wrong direction as the knight comes in to d4. This was the idea of placing the queen on c5. The knight hits the bishop. If the bishop goes back to a safe square, then it's knight b3. Here we see the problem. Having played the move a3, it's a knight fork. Black is winning material. This is problematic. If you go back with the bishop to a4, then you can kick the bishop. With another move, the bishop will have to go back. This is looking awful for white. So instead, white decided to protect the bishop with the queen. But the bishop in open position is usually a good piece. Therefore, this sequence of moves is not great for white. Here, knight takes bishop was played. White recaptures. And the queen comes in to c2. This is the idea. You're offering the exchange of queens, but you also hit the pawn on b2. Now, once again, if you do exchange queens, black is simply much more active and pawns can be pushed. This looks great for black. White is not going to cooperate. Decided to keep the queens on the board with the move queen d4. Now it's rook c5. The rook joins play, hits the knight. And, well, you have to decide what to do with that knight. If you go back, then the pawn on b2 is hanging, so that's not good. Maybe the knight can go to d6. I'm not sure why white didn't play this move. Maybe he was afraid here for a move like rook d5 with a double attack, but white can just capture the pawn and keep the knight defended. So I think knight d6 was still a good move. Instead, look at this. White played first the move a4, protecting the knight. Now the knight goes to d5. This looks very, very nice. And white is not able to do anything here. You can never really play a move like rook c1 because it runs into back rank checkmate. So that's not possible, and you can also not kick the rook away from c5 because of rook c4 attacking the queen, hitting the pawn on b4 and the knight on d5. Now we see the reason why the knight is so fantastically placed there. Instead of a pawn, the knight protects the pawn on b6 and hits the pawn on b4. Back to the game. Instead, Msellek played now the move knight d6, but you see that then the move a4 becomes more useless. You only play the move a4 to maintain that knight on b5. Now the knight is there. We are going to chase the white pieces with the move rook c6, attacking the knight, and the knight is in trouble. If you go to e5, well, then the queen protects the knight and keeps the pawn on b2 defended, but there is f6. And the queen got to choose. If the queen goes away, you take the pawn on b2. So there's no possibility of maintaining that knight on d6. Instead, the knight went back to e4. But now, rook c4. Black is dominating the c file. The rook comes to a more active square, hits the queen. Queen goes to e5 now. And it's rook takes a4. Here we see the pawn weakness. Black, instead of being 2 pawns down in the opening, he is a pawn up at this point. Rook ac1. Attacking the queen goes away. You can, of course, not take the pawn on b2. It's defended by the queen on e5. Queen d6 played. But why is this played, actually? That's the question. Now the pawn can be taken. White wants to take the pawn on d7. He's aiming for exchanges, simplifications. But rook a1. Massive pressure against the rook on c1. And white's back rank in general. White is in big trouble here. Play the move rook c8 check. And of course you can just take on c8, but Magnus played a very clever move, king h7. There's no time to take on a8 because black is threatening just to take on e1. If you do take on a1 yourself, then it's rook takes a1 with checkmate again. Here you see black's king is absolutely safe. White's king is mated. Thanks to the move h6, it's never going to be checkmate for white. So instead, white tried here the move rook f1, but you cannot really call it a try. After rook takes f1, king takes f1, it's rook a1 and Msellek resigned. What an amazing opening. The game itself was also attractive, nice positional understanding displayed by world's #1. But How about this opening? Will we get to see more games being played with this variation? Let me know in the comments what you think of this game. Please subscribe to the channel once again. And I appreciate all your support. See you soon again.